What if the ride you thought would get you home safely was actually the ride that could make you disappear forever? That's the question that's haunted me ever since the night I almost vanished into a gray minivan that pretended to be my Uber. And I'm sharing this because this isn't just some random Uber horror you watch on YouTube and then forget it was my reality. And it could happen to anyone, especially if you're a tourist. Like I was just trying to enjoy a few days in Washington, D.C. with my fiancée Sarah, surrounded by monuments and neon lights, completely clueless that there are predators out there hunting for easy targets under the glow of rideshare apps. And even though I'd always thought stories about fake Uber drivers were just urban legends told in True Scary Stories compilations, that night proved how terrifyingly real a rideshare nightmare can become. Because it doesn't take a shadowy alley or a dark basement to become a victim. All it takes is one silent driver, one locked door, and one wrong turn, and suddenly you're trapped inside a moving coffin rolling through unfamiliar streets with no clue where you're being taken or what's waiting at the end of the ride. And if you're watching this because you love creepy encounters and think you'd never fall for it, let me tell you, I thought the same thing until the moment I saw the notification on Sarah's phone telling us our real Uber had just arrived, while we were already speeding away with a stranger behind the wheel. And that's when I realized, sometimes your worst Uber horror doesn't start when you get in the car. It starts when you realize you're already in the wrong one. After spending hours exploring the monuments and glowing streets of Washington, D.C., my legs felt like lead, and all I wanted was to get back to our hotel room, peel off my shoes, and collapse beside Sarah. But as we stepped out of the bright lights and into the shadows creeping along Constitution Avenue, I remember how the air shifted, turning colder, as if the city itself knew what was about to happen. And we didn't think twice when Sarah pulled out her phone and opened the Uber app, because in my mind, rideshare apps were safe, familiar, and the last thing I ever expected to become my own Uber horror story. So while she tapped in our hotel address, I leaned against a lamppost and let my eyes drift over the glint of wet pavement and distant headlights streaking by. And when she looked up at me and said, "Our ride's 4 minutes away," I felt relieved, not realizing that this was the precise moment when our reality started to split in two. Because the truth is, there's a thin, almost invisible line between a normal Uber ride and a rideshare nightmare. And you never know you've crossed it until it's too late. And that line started blurring the instant a gray minivan rolled to a stop right at the curb. Even though the street was nearly deserted, and Sarah, trusting the glowing screen in her hand more than her gut, stepped forward and asked the man behind the wheel Uber for Sarah, and he just gave the smallest nod without uttering a single word, which should have been our first red flag. Because a real driver almost always greets you, confirms your name, or at least smiles like a human being. But in that split second between the cool night breeze and the neon reflections bouncing off rain-slicked asphalt, we ignored the silence. We ignored the fact that he never spoke, and we slid into the back seat of that gray van, thinking the ride was going to take us back to safety, unaware that this was the beginning of a true scary story that would twist into something I'd only ever heard about on Creepy Encounters videos. And as the van pulled away from the curb and swallowed us into the shadows of DC's empty streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, like the driver was deliberately avoiding eye contact in the rearview mirror. And even though I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, the faint smell of sweat and old upholstery creeping through the cabin made my stomach tighten, because I suddenly realized that while the app might say your driver is safe, the truth is you never really know who's behind the wheel. And in that moment, as the city lights grew smaller behind us, I had no idea that the most chilling part of my Uber horror story was still to come, waiting just a few blocks ahead, ready to shatter the fragile sense of safety we thought we had, as the fake driver steered us further away from the route we should have been taking, which is exactly where everything started spiraling into a nightmare that I'll never forget. As soon as the gray minivan pulled away from the curb and merged into the night, something in my gut started screaming that we'd made a mistake, because even though the city was still glowing in neon reflections across the rain-slicked streets, the inside of the van felt like a vacuum where sound and light couldn't exist. And Sarah sat stiff beside me, clutching her phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white, while I kept glancing at the driver in the rearview mirror, hoping he'd look back, say something normal, or even crack a nervous smile. But instead his eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead, and the only sound inside the van was the low hum of the tires over wet asphalt. A sound that suddenly felt way too loud and way too final, and it didn't take long before Sarah nudged me with her elbow and mouthed, "Check the map." So I leaned closer as she tilted her phone just enough for me to see that the little blue dot representing us was sliding further and further away from the highlighted route. And even though it might seem small in that moment, it felt like my entire world flipped upside down because the realization hit me like a punch to the chest that we were not heading toward our hotel, but instead driving deeper into streets I didn't recognize. And that's the terrifying thing about a rideshare nightmare. It doesn't announce itself with flashing lights or monstrous figures. It creeps in quietly disguised as normal life, until suddenly you're staring at the back of a stranger's head and wondering if this is the night your face ends up on a true scary story video titled "Couple Disappears in Fake Uber." And I remember swallowing hard and trying to keep my voice steady as I leaned forward and said, "Hey, I think you're going the wrong way." But the driver didn't even blink, didn't turn, didn't acknowledge me at all. And the silence was so suffocating that I actually felt the heat of my own breath bouncing off the seat in front of me, and I tried again, louder. "Sir, you're not following the route, but still nothing. Just the rhythmic slap of windshield wipers as we slid past empty intersections." And that's when Sarah's phone vibrated in her hand, and the notification popped up on her screen saying, "Your Uber has arrived," which made my blood run ice cold because we were already in a car, already barreling down dark streets with a man who'd barely even spoken, and my mind flashed with headlines I'd seen about fake Uber drivers lurking around cities waiting for the perfect moment to pick up unsuspecting tourists like us. And right then, in that electric moment of terror, I knew that whatever happened next was going to decide whether this was just another creepy Uber horror story I'd tell my friends, or the last story anyone would ever tell about me and Sarah. And as my pulse roared in my ears, I felt the weight of every viral true scary story I'd ever watched pressing down on me, because the horror wasn't some ghost or monster. It was the chilling reality that the person behind the wheel was pretending to be someone he wasn't. And that realization would push us both into a choice neither of us was ready to make, which leads directly into the moment that changed everything. My heart was hammering so hard in my chest I could feel it pulsing in my temples, as Sarah and I exchanged a look that said everything without words, because even though we were both trying to stay calm, I could see the panic building in her eyes. And there's nothing that makes your stomach drop faster than realizing you're trapped inside a moving vehicle with a stranger who refuses to talk, who's taking you in the opposite direction of where you're supposed to go. And while every mile we drove deeper into the night felt like another nail sealing our fate, I tried one last time to break the silence, leaning forward and saying in a louder, sharper voice, "Sir, I said you're going the wrong way." But the fake Uber driver didn't even flinch, his knuckles white around the steering wheel, as the neon lights outside washed over his face in pulses of red and blue like a silent alarm. And it was in that moment that the smell of stale sweat and cheap air freshener mixed with the faint tang of cigarette smoke hit me like a wall, making me gag because that smell felt all wrong. Like the smell of fear trapped inside metal doors. And the longer he stayed silent, the more I started to imagine headlines flashing across my brain about tourists who vanished in big cities, victims of Uber horror stories and rideshare nightmares. And my mind kept replaying the same terrifying question. What if this was the last night anyone ever saw me or Sarah again? And as my brain screamed at me to do something, I realized there was no sound except the hiss of tires rolling over wet pavement and the occasional click of the turn signal. But we weren't turning. We were just drifting further away from anything familiar. And that's when I felt the weight of the knife in my pocket. The small folding blade I'd carried for years, but never thought I'd actually need. And every instinct in my body told me that if I didn't act now, we might never get another chance. So I leaned forward even further, voice low and dangerous, and said, "I know you're not our Uber driver. Pull this van over right now, or I swear to God I'll use this." And for a split second, he glanced at me in the rearview mirror. And in those cold, flat eyes, I saw absolutely nothing. No fear, no anger, just emptiness. Like I was staring into a void. And I realized that whatever this man was planning, he hadn't decided yet if he was going to let us walk away or make sure we disappeared. And as the van kept rolling through darkened streets, I held my breath, waiting to see if my threat would be enough to change the ending of our true scary story, knowing that the next few seconds were going to define whether we escaped or became another viral creepy encounter, which leads straight into the moment when he finally made his choice. For what felt like an eternity, the only thing moving in that van was the flicker of passing streetlights streaking across the ceiling like ghostly fingers. and in the silence that followed my threat. My entire body tensed, waiting for the fake Uber driver to either slam the brakes or reach for something hidden beneath his seat. But instead, he kept driving for a few seconds longer, as if weighing his options. And then without warning, he jerked the wheel to the right, and the van veered sharply toward the curb tires, screeching against the wet asphalt, making Sarah gasp as she grabbed onto my arm so tightly I thought her nails might draw blood. And the van shuddered to a halt, engine idling, steam rising in faint wisps from the hood under the glow of a street lamp that made the raindrops look like a million tiny diamonds suspended in midair. And for a single terrifying moment, none of us moved, and all I could hear was the rush of my own blood in my ears pounding like war drums. Because part of me thought he might turn around and try to drag us into the back of the van, but instead he just flicked his eyes toward me in the mirror one last time and said in a voice so low it was almost drowned out by the rain, "You two should be more careful. This city has places you'll never leave." And there was something so casual, so eerily calm about the way he said it that my skin erupted in goosebumps, because it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a fact, as if he knew secrets about DC that tourists like us could never imagine. And before either of us could react, he unlocked the doors with a sharp electronic click, his eyes sliding away from ours as though we'd suddenly ceased to exist. And even though every cell in my body screamed at me to run, I felt rooted to my seat, stunned by the knowledge that we'd come within inches of becoming just another headline in a true scary story video. And as Sarah tugged at my sleeve, whispering, "Come on, we have to go," I forced myself to shove the door open and stumble out into the night air, my legs trembling so badly I thought they'd give out under me. And the second we hit the sidewalk, the van peeled away from the curb, tires hissing through puddles as taillights disappeared into the darkness, leaving us alone on an empty street that suddenly felt 10 degrees colder. And while Sarah clung to my arm, crying and shaking, I kept glancing over my shoulder, because deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over yet, that maybe the fake Uber driver was circling back. And that's the terrifying part of any Uber horror story: the ride might end, but the fear keeps following you long after the engine goes silent. And as we stood there catching our breath, I knew we weren't safe yet, because the next few minutes were going to be all about figuring out how the hell to get home without getting into another vehicle that might swallow us whole. Which takes us right into the aftermath of what happened once we finally managed to call the real Uber driver. We stood there on the sidewalk in the drizzle, shivering under the orange glow of the street lamp, while my brain tried to process what had just happened. Because even though the van had vanished into the darkness, the echo of the fake Uber driver's words, "This city has places you'll never leave," kept ringing in my ears like a warning siren, and the longer we stood there, the more I felt like the shadows were closing in, as though every passing car might be him coming back to finish what he'd started. And Sarah was practically glued to my side, trembling and wiping tears from her cheeks, whispering over and over, "We could have died. We could have died." And I kept looking around, half expecting to see that gray minivan creeping around the corner, headlights off, waiting for us to drop our guard. Because that's the thing. Nobody tells you about living through a rideshare nightmare. It doesn't end when you step out of the car. The fear crawls under your skin and nests there, making you jump at every sudden noise. And as I pulled my phone out with shaking fingers to open the Uber app for real this time, I felt like my whole body was buzzing with adrenaline and rage and disbelief that we'd been so close to becoming another viral headline in a true scary story video. And when the screen finally loaded, showing the little car icon approaching, I checked every detail, like my life depended on it. Make, model, license plate, driver's face, even the tiny star rating, because the thought of getting into another car felt impossible. Yet standing there all night wasn't an option either. And when the real Uber driver finally arrived, rolling up in a white Toyota Corolla, I practically interrogated him through the window, demanding his name, where he was coming from, and whether he knew our hotel address. And even though he looked a little startled, he answered every question without missing a beat. And it wasn't until Sarah and I were both strapped into the back seat that I allowed myself to exhale, though my eyes stayed glued to the screen, tracking every turn to make sure we weren't being led away again. And as we started moving through the quiet DC streets, the real driver glanced at us in the mirror and asked gently, "You guys okay?" And the look Sarah and I shared must have told him everything, because he didn't ask anything else for a while, letting the soft hum of the engine and the gentle patter of rain against the windows fill the silence that hung over us like a thick fog. And that's when, in the hush between red lights, he told us something that froze my blood all over again. And it's the piece of this Uber horror story that still makes my skin crawl every time I think about it. leading us right into the chilling revelation that made this night go from terrifying to utterly unforgettable. The real Uber driver kept glancing at us through the mirror with a mix of concern and curiosity, and I could tell he was debating whether to pry further because even though Sarah and I were trying to calm down, our bodies were still practically vibrating with adrenaline, and my eyes were darting to every passing vehicle, like I expected that gray minivan to appear out of nowhere and ram us off the road. And after a few blocks of silence, the driver finally cleared his throat and said, "I know it's none of my business, but you two look like you've just seen a ghost." And that's when everything spilled out of me like a flood. All the fear, the disbelief, the sickening realization that we'd been trapped in a stranger's car pretending to be our Uber. And as I recounted every detail, the driver who didn't speak the wrong route, the way he'd ignored us until I threatened him with a knife. I noticed the driver's expression slowly harden from polite concern to something darker, and he said, "You guys are lucky," in a voice so low it barely rose above the hum of the tires on wet asphalt. And that's when he dropped the bombshell that made my blood run cold all over again. Because he told us that in the past few months, there'd been a string of incidents all across DC where fake Uber drivers were prowling around tourist areas, picking up people who didn't double-check their driver's name or license plate, and while some victims were just robbed and left on the side of the road, others simply disappeared and were never seen again. And my stomach twisted into knots as he explained how these predators targeted people who looked tired, distracted, or unfamiliar with the city, which described Sarah and me perfectly that night. And the more he talked, the more I felt the van's stale air pressing down on my chest, because it suddenly hit me how close we'd come to being another headline in a true scary story video, the kind with titles like "Couple Vanishes in Rideshare Nightmare." And as he pulled up to a red light, his eyes flicked to mine in the mirror, and he said, "Always check the app. Always match the car, the driver's face, and the license plate. Don't just ask, 'Are you my Uber?' because that's exactly what these guys count on." And while the neon reflections from a nearby bar flashed across the windshield, I felt this cold wave of shame and gratitude crash over me all at once, because I realized that a single careless moment had nearly cost us our lives. And as the car started rolling again, Sarah reached for my hand and held it so tight my fingers went numb. And it dawned on me that this nightmare wasn't just about one creepy ride. It was about how easily any of us could fall into the same trap, which leads directly into how we finally made it back to our hotel, still checking over our shoulders, afraid that our fake Uber driver might somehow find us again. By the time the real Uber driver finally dropped us off outside our hotel, my legs felt like they were made of rubber, and even though the neon lights of the lobby spilled out onto the wet pavement like a promise of safety, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Because as Sarah and I practically ran through the sliding glass doors, my eyes kept scanning every parked car along the curb, half expecting to see that same gray minivan lurking in the shadows, engine idling, waiting for a second chance. And it's wild how a single Uber horror experience can rewrite your entire sense of reality. Because just hours earlier, I'd been strolling past monuments and laughing under city lights. And now every sound felt suspicious, every face a potential predator. And when we got inside the elevator, Sarah pressed the button for our floor with shaking fingers, and we stood there in silence as the numbers ticked upward. The bright glow of the floor indicator reflecting off the stainless steel walls, and even though the doors eventually opened with a soft chime, it felt like stepping into another world. Because our hotel room smelled familiar, like shampoo and fresh sheets, a stark contrast to the musty scent of fear that still clung to my clothes. And for a long moment, we just stood there inside the room, neither of us speaking, both of us listening for footsteps in the hallway. And I remember how Sarah finally collapsed onto the bed and burst into tears, sobbing so hard I thought her whole body might shake apart. And I sat down beside her and tried to hold it together, but my own hands were trembling, and my mind kept replaying every second of that rideshare nightmare, wondering how close we'd come to disappearing forever. Because that's the thing people don't always understand about true scary stories. It's not just the few minutes of terror, it's how the fear follows you home, crawls into your bed with you and makes you question everything you thought was safe. And even as I tried to tell myself it was over, that we were safe behind locked doors, part of me couldn't stop thinking about the fake Uber driver's voice, and how he'd said, "This city has places you'll never leave." Because it made me wonder if maybe we'd escaped him physically, but he'd still left a part of himself behind in our minds, haunting us every time we see a gray van, or get a new ping from the Uber app. And the scariest part of this whole Uber horror story isn't just that a stranger tried to abduct us, it's how easily it could happen to anyone. And as I stared out the hotel window at the wet streets below, I realized that some rides you can cancel with a swipe, but others stay with you forever, burning themselves into your memory, like a neon sign you can't switch off. After hearing these 4 Uber horror stories, I know one thing for sure. Sometimes the scariest monsters don't hide under your bed or lurk in dark forests. They sit quietly behind a steering wheel, wearing a polite smile, waiting for you to let your guard down. And if there's one lesson running through all these true scary stories, it's that the places we trust the most, like the backseat of a rideshare, can turn into cages. The second we forget to question what's real, and who's behind the wheel, and whether it's a man staring dead-eyed in your rearview mirror, a passenger whispering about ghosts, a delivery driver lurking outside your window, or a fake driver steering you toward places you might never leave, the fear that slams into your chest is all the same. The gut-wrenching realization that safety is never guaranteed. And as much as these rideshare nightmares might feel like the stuff of Creepy Encounters videos, the truth is they can happen to anyone anywhere. Even on streets you think you know by heart, because evil doesn't always announce itself with flashing lights and dramatic music. It sometimes wears the face of normalcy until suddenly you're trapped questioning every decision that brought you there. And the scariest part is how quickly everything can go from familiar to utterly alien in the blink of an eye. And if you've ever thought you'd never fall for it, remember that. So did the people in these stories. And that's exactly why these videos exist, to remind us that staying aware could be the difference between getting home safe and becoming the next headline. So if you've ever had a rideshare experience that made the hairs on your arms stand up, share it in the comments below. Because your story might just save someone else from living their own nightmare. And don't forget to hit like, save this video, so you can warn your friends and subscribe. Because the next time your phone buzzes with a new ride request, you might just discover there's a 5th Uber horror story waiting to be told, and it could be yours.